My name is Esther Venrooy, and I would like to thank the organizers of 2 Days of Art, and specifically Florian for inviting me over to visit my home country, the Netherlands. I am currently living and working in Belgium as a teacher of an art academy and working as a composer in the field of electronic music and sound art. And today I'm going to talk with you a little bit about my own work, but more about my thoughts on this topic, sound, silence and space, a topic a lot of people at this moment talk about, think about and reflect about. And when I came here for this symposium, I had to look up the word ubiquitous, which is omnipresent, everywhere, being everywhere. And this is definitely one of the true experiences I have since I studied sound or studied music. Worked with sound artists, worked with dancers. Sound is everywhere and you cannot escape it. And if there is no sound, like in a dead space, you can still hear yourself. The speech or lecture is about auditory sketch, which is a name I use in my workshops when I work with students, what I use in my practice, and I'm gonna explain a little bit about it. So, like I told you, I am a sound artist, so I release music, and this is where I came from. I studied years ago saxophone, classical saxophone, no jazz. And for me, it was a very limited world, the world of music, or the classical music world, the contemporary classic music world. And I met one of my teachers who sort of showed me the way to electronic music, and that's why also I moved to Belgium. And this is a piece which was based or inspired by the Dutch landscape, where I recorded on a dike near the river. I recorded the boats passing by, which is a sort of an oral memory of mine when I was young, growing up. What was new for me is that I turned to sound art, and the definition of sound art might have been given here. There is not a really clear definition of sound art. There are people who call themselves sound artists who make music which has sort of a chance element in it, or there are people making sculptures who are sounding, or there are video artists who also make the soundtrack. So sound art is very broad or very narrow. The area I am in is the area where you can have a sonic environment which you can enter, and where you can have a physical experience of sound, which is not so uncommon. You also can have a very physical at a heavy metal concert of sound. But what I am doing is I'm working with the physics of sound, the way it moves in space, and I try to compose it, not only in time, but more in a spatial sense. And therefore I need technology. So for me as an artist, I don't work from the concept of technology. I know about particular equipment, but it starts actually with a pure concept or an idea, usually a very sonic idea, something I can describe a little bit. I collaborate with architects and artists who help creating the environment or help create an installation, which can be, in this case, this was you will see some more pictures of it. This was a city in Kortrijk, and we created on 3 floors a sort of elevated surface where people could sit or stand on, and the sound would come through the boards. I used transducers, which are machines who use an audio signal to send into a material. And this material can be anything. It can be wood, it can be glass. But what is interesting about this technology is that the sound is projected differently. It doesn't come exactly from a point. It's more like a field which arises. And you see people sitting and standing on this installation, a work I made with a Belgian artist, Hans de Meulenaar. Another work I made I just go over some work so you just have some idea where I come from or what I'm doing. This is a work in Concertgebouw in Bruges, which is also in Belgium. And they asked me to make an installation in a hallway going from the 7th floor till the 5th. And what was fascinating about this space, because it's a space nobody ever uses, it's sort of only in use when there is a fire, which is almost, doesn't happen. So this is sort of concrete, not depressing, because it's kind of light space. And we were fascinated by the fact that it has a strong reflections. And the idea was to work with this concept of reflection and refraction. And I worked in this case with Olivier Goethals. And we implemented on specific points in space, we implemented speakers who were sort of giving shots into the hallway, which were very strong. And we implemented also mirrors, so there was this reflection of the architecture. So my fascination, as you can see, and this is another word, is about the integration of sound art in architecture. It's really about how does sound move in a space, what is a space, and also how can you move into a space. And I refer not to every kind of space, I'm always referring to spaces in buildings. Yeah. And this is really also my research, because I started a PhD in 2009, which is about this integration of sound art and architecture. When I started this project years ago, it was actually only my ambition to, I was fascinated by sound, as being a saxophone player and being able to create my own sound. Then have this relationship with an audience like I have now. I'm talking to you and you watch me, and there is this element of time. But what I liked specifically about visual art, that you can set up an environment and it's up to the audience or the listener itself to leave or enter the situation. So somebody can leave and say, this is crap, and leaving after 5 seconds, or somebody can stay for 30 minutes. And I found this really interesting to let this over to other people. So this was the area I was looking for. And also the second thing was, when you are an instrumentalist, you have sort of a medium, and your medium is this instrument in front of you, or it can be your voice, but usually it's an instrument. And it's sort of also the visual focus point of somebody looking, like there is a particular focus point on me right now when I'm talking. And what I liked about that people become more aware of themselves and more aware of where they are. It's like I wanted to create situations where when you as a listener would enter and completely be absorbed by yourself, that you yourself are projecting your own memories and ideas on what you would hear. So this was my ambition, and I'm not the only one, and certainly not the first one who was it. So I'm going to go over some people I found really interesting, and the way also they communicate to us. So this is the artist Max Neuhaus, who is more well known in the sound art world these last years. And he's well known for making site-specific work, usually in places you don't expect to be a sound art installation. And also usually the case that there is not his name or an explanation board where there is a work. And there are like 3 audiences for this. People who hear it and are not aware that there is a sound. They don't really hear it. People who know that there is an installation, they look for it and they listen to it. And there are people who specifically are looking for it and not hearing it. So this is really a fascinating attitude as an artist, to not leave your particular signature. His work became famous in another way, not so much by his installations, but through this way. These were his drawings, were a collection of line drawings of creating a sense of place or space, which is not really specific, because this could be anywhere. This could be in America, this could be actually in this building. And like poem-like sentences. This work he would sell, and this work would make him famous. So I find it's really interesting that he didn't become so much famous in the first instance through his installations, but through drawings. What he says about a drawing is really interesting. He says, after finishing a sound work, if time allows, I wait several months before listening to it again. This is the first time I can stand outside the work and see what it is that I have made. It is only at this point, after experiencing the work with distance, that I can make its circumscription drawing. And this drawing, 2 panels, a visual image and a handwritten text, integrates 2 traditional forms of communication to circumscribe something both invisible and indescribable. The image is not the drawing, nor is the text. The drawing is what they synthesize together. What read in parallel, they evoke a central idea of the sound work, a point of departure and a reference for reflection. And this I found really interesting. For him, it was important to draw after the work with some distance, like he has to become more objective towards his own creation. And also how he uses it. He says it's a sort of idea. It's not accurate. A point of departure, a reference, something for reflection to think about. And this I find, which is really important, and I want to emphasize in this lecture, is about being accurate about things. In sound, you cannot be accurate. And I will explain a little bit later. I just want to go also to another artist, somebody you probably also know. This is the drawing of Bernhard Leitner, which is a sound artist. Actually, he used to be an architect and urban planner, creating installations. And his work is more based on the concept of sound as being lines. And in this work, he wanted to create a sound cube or a sound room with a lot of speakers where sound would travel following the lines, creating different kind of movement patterns. So what I find interesting in this drawing is also the sort of naive idea that sound can be a line, because sound doesn't work as a line. Sound is sort of everywhere. It has a point of departure. It is louder towards its source, but then it becomes more of a cloud. So what I find also fascinating about it, in the last drawing of Max Neuhaus, he doesn't really draw the sound. He just describes the sound and the space. And in this drawing, the space is really accurate, almost like computer accurate. But the sound is also quite accurate, and which is, to be honest, not really possible unless you do particular things, to be projecting sound in a different way. For me, this is also interpreting, or what I see in it, that I see a visual artist, somebody who somehow understands composition and construction of composition through seeing. I find it really fascinating that's the way he sees sound. There are more artists. I find, for instance, the work of Michael Asher very interesting, which is an American artist who creates sort of social sculptures, and one of his famous pieces is a gallery space where he puts in a wall, and where the light doesn't enter the space anymore, where the space gets darker, the sound gets more absorbed by isolation material, so it gets more quiet in the dark of this gallery space. So he created acoustical interventions in this space. I find it really interesting artist. Another artist who I find really fascinating, who is part of the research, is Marianne Amaché, who not only works in the area of creating sounds in space and placing very precise, also very intuitively, but also listening really well, speakers in space, but she also uses frequencies who create an extra tone, and the tone is not physically out there, but the tone is created in the mind. So there are so many artists from the 60s and 70s who have investigated in this sound and architecture area. So for me, so many questions came, and the questions are in Dutch, but it's just visually to show you that I had a lot of questions. I can translate some. So, one of the questions is, how can I perceive a space through sound? Or what do I need to know as an artist to start working in this area to create psychoacoustic effects? And is it possible to create a space or a sense of space by only creation of sounds? And can I filter the sound of the environment by pulling up a wall? And the interesting for me part was that somehow when I started reading, one of the most shocking thing was, okay, I am a composer, I've been working for years. I always thought, you know, sound is just, that's it. It is like very evident, but it is not. And when I started reading into it, people really stated that we still do not really understand how sound works. And I was then a bit confused. So I dived into the next questions. How do we experience a space through sound, and what and where is the sound, and how to build an auditive space? So my whole research started leading to almost the basic questions, like what is the sound and where is it? I found my answers in different kinds of books. This is also fascinating because usually I have to call many different apartments. So you have the apartment of architecture, you have to go to music department, acoustic department, sometimes even mathematics. So you're going to several areas, and there is not really one particular library you can go to. And slowly I seem to go to the core of questions, which I was also surprised that it's extremely hard to find an answer to this question because there are many answers. One of the books I really want to recommend, probably you all, because I think there are also a lot of architects here, In Praise of Shadows. What I find really fascinating about it is just the entrance of the book, where he says, or Charles Moore says, that musicians everywhere make their sounds to capture silence, or that architects develop complex shapes just to envelope empty space. This sentence was for me a trigger point, because it became very clear I had to ask these questions, which is, what is silence? Is silence something which we can create, like we can create or produce sounds? Because in a sense, sounds is sort of present, and when it's not present, it's silence, and there is no such thing as silence. So I had to slowly cut through the core to the basic questions, and I sort of also was surprised. I thought there were already books about it, like, okay, there I find the answer, and of course I went to the main reference book, going into the work of John Cage, the Book of Silence. And then I was surprised that it was really not exactly about silence, so the concept of what silence is. So one of the main chapters of my research is about silence, and we can write a whole book about it. Actually, there's a very interesting exhibition in America now about silence, and many views about silence. And they follow sort of the view of Susan Sontag, which is the concept as silence being a full void. Silence is the artist remaining silent, or the musician remaining silent. It's not about absolute silence, which is sort of not possible except maybe in space when there is no atmosphere. But in what my practice says, because this PhD is an art PhD, it's very much about the process of creation and listening. And this element always comes back in every work I made, if it's a composition or it's an installation, that I sit down in whatever space, can be my own room, or it can be in a particular set. You have to start listening to what the sound of the space is like. Sometimes I need to produce sounds to understand how the reflections are. And I also need to sit down for a long time to see if it's during the day or in the evening and what the difference is. For understanding to make a piece of work, sometimes I need to walk also around to see how much time I have or need to go from one area to another area. So understanding these questions and filling these, finding these answers, it's kind of an interesting journey I never thought I would go into. And the the main thing is that if I can give some answers on what is a sound, is that there are many views at this moment about what it is. The traditional view is that sound is a wave, it's a movement in the air, it's a vibration. But then a lot of people are talking where they belong to. Some people say it's a property, it belongs to the source, like it's a characteristic of the source, like a bell. So the sound is part of this bell. And you cannot separate it from it. It's part of it, like the color is part of an apple. Yeah. There are people who say no, it's an event. It's something which happens, and it happens. It starts from a source, and it's now happening around us. And then in this question, where is it? Is the sound there at the source, and we over time perceive sort of the after image or the echo from it, or is it in our head? Do we perceive particular frequencies, and it's our head generating this sound experience? So many people give different answers. So not only is it interesting, it's really fascinating to talk about it. And then you have music people, composers, sound artists who talk about it. For instance, Pierre Schaeffer, an old pioneer in electronic music, who says it's an object. We can extract it from the source. We can isolate it and treat it like an object. And then you get these loudspeaker orchestras, which are fascinating. And then you have Murray Schafer, who says there are different kinds of sound. You have a sound which can be in the foreground, like a sound signal, or a sound which is very particular for a particular area, which is a sound mark. Like you have a landmark, you have a sound mark. Like the bell from Ghent is a particular bell, and it belongs to the city. Very complex matter, and very complex because I still need to enter further. And one of the people who gives a lot of lectures about it, and specifically is somebody from this area, you probably also know, is Raviv Kanchov. And he's actually saying you have to look at the materiality of sound. And this is where the problem comes in, because you can't see it, it's invisible. And because it's invisible, people are fascinated by it. It has no body, it has no object. It's mysterious. So you have to look at the materiality of sound and sort of understand the building stones of it. Well, one of the things I have done is not so much look at the building stones, but follow a little bit this book. It's a book which is famous. It's from Kandinsky, Punkt und Linie zu Flache, which is composition theory in the visual art, in the visual world. How do you create through simple elements a space? Which was for me interesting, because if I could make it like, how do you create through the basic elements an auditive space? So when I went to my promoter, Mark de Lare, and co-promoter Sven Sterke, an architect theorist, we were talking about this book and they told me, listen, Esther, maybe you should talk about creating an auditive space and writing about it so that people can understand how you build this spatial sense through sound. And I was fascinated, of course, by Kandinsky, because this book by Kandinsky is fascinating, because his idea was that through color and on non-objective forms in painting, that they would be analogous to music. For him, this image would be music, you know. So I found it really interesting. So I went into to follow his idea, which is Punkt, which is the smallest element, line, and then you get plane. So the first theory in talking to my promoter and co-promoter was to get from point to line to plane, and then sort of divide it into, this is a theory about auditive space, that you get two directions. One would be the auditive space, which is static. I called it volume. And this would be this idea that you have this sound environment which is constant, where you can walk in and you can walk out. Max Neuhaus also writes about it, which is fascinating. He created this sort of cloud, which you really, when you are here, you don't hear it, but when you are here, you can experience the sound. The other idea was to create a field which is more dynamic. This idea that you create an environment where there is sort of a temporal event happening, something dynamic happening, and where time could play an element, which could mean that there was a click here and then 5 seconds later a click there. There's a sort of more dynamic field idea. But when I started thinking about it, it made actually absolutely no sense. And this is the point actually what I'm trying to say. That this concept of point, line to plane, where you build a space, in audition or in listening or in sounding, it is not the same thing. And this is the reason my statement is space is in the essence present in sound. When you start working with sound and when you first start projecting sound, there is already spatiality. There is no sound. If there is no space, there is no sound. You need, so this whole idea of building an auditive space in the same way visual art or visual art theory works, it doesn't work the same way. What I did like though is the fact that you can make an interpretation of point, of a line, and of a plane in sound. So for instance, for me, a point would be this speaker, which projects a particular sound. A point could be, for me, a short sound like this. This could be a point for me. Points can be really literally also visually. I'm thinking, for instance, of the work of Rolf Julius, who is a sound artist, and he made this installation with small speakers on the wall, black dots, almost like a Kandinsky-like way, with lines through it, and there were some really small, beautiful environmental sounds coming from it. This was also his interpretation of a point. Plane was a bit more difficult, how to interpret a plane. A plane would be a surface. So that's why I found the transducers interesting, because I could create more of a cloud or a field in this, and the literal sense of a plane, which can be a board or this area here, could be something very physical, and I could understand it. A line was more difficult, because what could be a line? Of course it can be a wire here, but that's only the visual aspect. A line can be also a reference between 1 and 2. That you say you have a one sound here, and then the other sound again, and there is a connection between the two. So you fill in, as a listener, the line. So this was the other approach, the turnaround. And I come to the next sort of statement I'm going to make about being accurate in sound. For me, sound and a recording equipment, it's not accurate. It's not exact. For me, it's a creation. You decide at a particular time to use particular microphones to enhance particular sounds, and you press your button at a particular moment. Even though you're sort of passive of entering the data, but still this for me is a creation. Not something very objective. Not something you have nothing to do with. Also, the essence of space disappears, because you can also have this really high-tech recording equipment. Still, the reality of listening and experiencing sound is completely different from a recording. And also not very useful if you work with architects or other people, and I'll explain you why. Like I told you before, I was working on a project called Shifting Grounds, which was in Kortrijk. This was in the tower on 3 floors, and this was in collaboration with Hans de Meulenaar. I'll show you the tower. And when they started, I have to talk to the organizer, saying what my idea was. So I started saying, like, okay, I want to build on 3 floors, and I had to communicate with the workmen and with Hans about my auditive ideas. What I did was record the environment on this very expensive recorder with extremely expensive microphones. But when I gave the audio file to Hans, for him it was like, you know, no reference point to that particular space, no reference point to particular auditive idea. So for me, working with recording a space and then giving the sound files to the people is like really not working well. So what I came up with was the auditory sketch, which was based on the work of Max Neuhaus and Bernhard Leitner, where you use anything, like from drawing, from photographs, from writing about a sonic event or a particular auditive concept, but not using video or not using recording. And I noticed it was very effective because people get more of a sense. So this was actually my first idea. I had this really sort of straightforward idea to create a circulation on the 3 floors of the sound, and that the sound would crawl up around the building. You see also I was very ambitious. Of course it was too expensive and I had to change my plan to a more extreme concept, which was low, mid, high. So I had an extreme low, like 60 hertz, 100 hertz sort of piece in the cellar, a circulation on the mid floor around mid frequency, and an extreme high sound, which was only a tweeter, which was projected in the roof, and it used the conic structure to project the sound. What was always important to me is that I always hide the loudspeakers, because I really want people to connect to the space and the sound, and I don't want these visual black ugly boxes in the site, and that people say, oh, there's a sound, ah, there's a sound. So I always, it's a bit, I'm over that problem I have. I can now accept speakers, but in the beginning I really wanted to hide them, and this is the final drawing. What I find interesting is somehow, even though you can't really hear it, you get more of a sense of how sound is moving in space, how much of sound there is. For sound engineers, this is really helpful because they know how much and where to put the sounds. Then the next problem came. There was a publication, so there were some really extremely nice drawings and photographs taken from this project. And then, of course, they came to me, so you also did something, so let's make a CD. And then I said, no, I don't want to make a CD, because like I told you from the beginning, a recording of that situation, somehow the spatiality disappears, you yourself moving in it disappears, also particular dramatic points disappear, so the whole sort of narrative in a space, and a space can also have a narrative for me, completely disappears. It makes no sense to make this CD. So I proposed to Hans to write about it. So instead of making a CD, I made these auditory sketches, which were my drawings and which were also my text. And what I also found really helpful, that I first give a sense of place, saying, okay, I'm on the ground floor, the space is dark, wooden panels on the floor, sounds coming from the panels, and it is possible to move around. And in this short text, I start from being very concrete, saying this sound and the description of sound, and then moving into something more like in a dreamlike state and coming back to reality. And I want to conclude with this: a sound recording is only an impression of a spatial event. We in the sound art world, and I see a lot of people also projecting themselves also. Usually you see people with headphones and like mics. This is a typical sound artist photo. And this also and when I meet sound artists, and I hope there are not too many here, and please don't be offended, I do find a lot of people's work interesting, but I always found that they're always talking about gear. They're always talking about how big their microphone is. Probably you have that in every field, probably also with cars. But for me, it's more interesting to talk about a sonic idea, and also the fact that technology is just a way to express yourself. It has always been like that. You need to know a lot about technology to make it more effective, I agree. But it's only an impression. It's not accurate. It's not objective. And for me, I find still a lot of inspiration with the works of the 60s and 70s people. And for me, we are still in that same area, thinking about the same things. And talking about sound is really important. Recording sounds is important. But I think we come to a point we have to evaluate what we've been doing and saying and seeing what we can do more effectively or draw conclusions, because we still have not found answers. And I notice this also because when I talk to acoustic designers, they still have are assigned, which is not accurate. They can make 3D models, but how sound really works is always very different. I think I want to leave it at this. Thank you.